The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Valenhall Palace as King Alexander stood before the towering windows of his private study. His weathered hands gripped the golden curtains, knuckles white with tension. At 62, the king had weathered many storms during his 30-year reign, but nothing had prepared him for the document spread across his mahogany desk. Lady Margaret Thornfield, his most trusted advisor, watched nervously from her position near the fireplace. She had served the crown for over 2 decades and had never seen the king so visibly shaken. The morning's revelations had struck the very foundation of the monarchy, threatening everything Alexander had worked to preserve. "Your Majesty," Lady Margaret ventured carefully, "perhaps we should discuss the implications before making any hasty decisions." Alexander turned from the window, his steel-gray eyes reflecting a mixture of betrayal and determination. The king's usually immaculate appearance showed signs of the sleepless night he had endured. His silver hair was disheveled, and his royal blue morning coat hung loosely on his tall frame. "Hasty?" he repeated, his voice carrying the weight of profound disappointment. "Margaret, what would you call 20 years of deception? What would you call systematic manipulation of palace finances and deliberate undermining of royal protocol?" The documents on his desk told a story that had unfolded gradually over months of discreet investigation. Bank statements showing unauthorized transfers, meeting records revealing secret communications with foreign diplomats, and most damaging of all, recorded conversations that painted Queen Consort, Victoria, in an entirely different light than the devoted wife the public knew. Victoria Ashworth had entered Alexander's life during a diplomatic reception in 2003. She was elegant, intelligent, and seemingly devoted to charitable causes. Their courtship had been brief but intense, and their marriage in 2005 had been celebrated as a love match that brought stability to the crown. The public adored her grace and her commitment to various humanitarian efforts. But the woman described in the intelligence reports was calculating and ambitious. The investigation, initiated by palace security after irregularities were discovered in the Queen Consort's office accounts, had uncovered a web of financial misconduct and political maneuvering that reached far beyond simple marital discord. Alexander picked up one of the recordings, a small digital device that contained hours of conversations between Victoria and her private secretary, Elena Rossi. The content had shattered his understanding of his marriage and his wife's true intentions. "She married me for the title, Margaret," he said quietly, setting the device down with trembling fingers. Every public appearance, every charitable endeavor, every moment of supposed intimacy was calculated to enhance her position and financial standing. Lady Margaret approached the desk cautiously. She had been present when the king first listened to the recordings 3 days earlier. The sound of his wife discussing him as nothing more than a pathway to wealth and international influence had been devastating to witness. "The transfers to the Cayman Islands alone total over £3 million, Alexander continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. Money that was supposed to support veterans' charities and educational programs. She diverted funds meant for the people's welfare into her personal accounts. The most damaging evidence came from Victoria's own words, captured during what she believed was a private conversation with her secretary. On the recording, she had laughed about the king's trust, referring to him as the old fool, and discussing plans to expand her influence over royal decisions. "The Swiss banking connections are particularly troubling," Lady Margaret noted, reviewing her own copy of the investigation summary. "Her communications with representatives from the Helvetian investment group suggest she's been sharing confidential information about palace operations and potentially state matters." Alexander nodded grimly. The Helvetian connection had raised red flags with both palace security and government intelligence services. Victoria's meetings with their representatives, initially disguised as charity consultations, had occurred regularly over the past 5 years. "She's compromised the crown's security," Alexander said, walking to his desk and placing his hand on the stack of evidence. "Her ambition has put our entire nation's diplomatic relationships at risk." The king's marriage had already been strained in recent years. Public appearances had become more formal, and palace staff had noticed the couple rarely spent private time together. But Alexander had attributed this to the natural evolution of a long marriage and the pressures of royal duties. The truth was far more calculated. Victoria had been methodically positioning herself to gain more official power within the monarchy, while simultaneously building her personal wealth through unauthorized means. Her charitable foundation, praised internationally for its efficiency, had been a front for money laundering and tax evasion. "The Prime Minister has been briefed," Lady Margaret informed him. "She's prepared to support whatever decision you make, but she's emphasized the need for discretion to prevent constitutional crisis." Alexander understood the delicate balance required. The monarchy's stability depended on public trust, and the revelation of such extensive corruption within the royal household could damage the institution permanently. Yet allowing Victoria to continue as Queen Consort was equally unthinkable. "Schedule an emergency meeting with the Privy Council for this afternoon," Alexander commanded, his voice returning to its customary authority, "and arrange for Victoria to be summoned to the throne room at 4 o'clock. "Your Majesty, are you certain about the timing?" Lady Margaret asked. "Perhaps allowing more time for—" "Margaret," Alexander interrupted. "Every day we delay is another day she continues to exploit her position. The investigation is complete, the evidence is irrefutable, and the decision is made." The king moved to the window again, looking out over the palace gardens where Victoria often hosted her charity events. The irony wasn't lost on him that those very events had likely facilitated much of her illegal activity. 20 years of marriage, Margaret. 20 years of believing I had found a partner who truly understood the weight of service to the crown. His voice carried profound sadness beneath the anger. Instead, I married someone who saw our monarchy as nothing more than a business opportunity. As the morning progressed, the palace would begin preparations for what would become one of the most dramatic confrontations in modern royal history. Queen Consort Victoria Ashworth adjusted her pearl necklace as she reviewed the morning's schedule in her private sitting room. The afternoon promised to be particularly rewarding, with meetings planned for 2 potential donors to her children's literacy foundation. At 55, Victoria had mastered the art of royal presentation, and her reputation as a dedicated humanitarian had opened doors throughout Europe's elite circles. Elena Rossi, her private secretary and closest confidant, entered the room carrying a silver tray with Victoria's customary afternoon tea. Elena had been with Victoria since before her marriage to Alexander, initially serving as her personal assistant during her career as an art curator in London. "The Pemberton estate has confirmed their contribution," Elena announced, setting down the tray with practiced elegance. £2 million for the new reading centres across Scotland. Victoria smiled with satisfaction. The Pemberton contribution would be processed through her foundation's main account, before being transferred to the various sub-accounts she had established over the years. Only a portion would actually reach the intended programs, while the majority would flow through her carefully constructed network of shell companies. "Excellent work, Elena. The timing couldn't be better with the Swiss transfers scheduled for next week." Their financial operation had become increasingly sophisticated over the years. What had begun as small redirections of charitable funds had evolved into a complex, international network that allowed Victoria to accumulate wealth while maintaining her public image as a selfless royal servant. "There's something else," Elena said, her voice carrying a note of concern. "I received an unusual call from the King's office this morning. They've requested your presence in the throne room at 4 o'clock today." Victoria paused, her teacup halfway to her lips. Formal summons to the throne room were rare, and typically reserved for state occasions or significant announcements. Alexander usually communicated with her through more informal channels, especially for personal matters. "Did they provide any context?" Victoria asked, setting down her cup with deliberate calmness. "None whatsoever. Lady Margaret Thornfield made the call personally, which struck me as odd. Usually such requests come through junior staff members." Victoria's mind began calculating possibilities. Alexander had been distant lately, but she had attributed this to his increasing age and the pressures of recent diplomatic challenges with neighboring kingdoms. Their marriage had long since evolved into a partnership of convenience, with both parties maintaining their public roles while pursuing separate private interests. "Perhaps it's related to the upcoming state visit from Queen Isabella of Merida," Victoria suggested, though something in Elena's expression indicated deeper concern. Elena moved closer to Victoria's chair, lowering her voice despite the privacy of the room. "There's something else that's been troubling me." I've noticed increased security presence around the palace over the past week. More guards, different patrol patterns, and I've seen unfamiliar faces among the staff. This information caused Victoria's carefully maintained composure to falter slightly. Enhanced security measures often indicated potential threats or significant changes in royal protocol. She had built her success on maintaining awareness of palace dynamics and political undercurrents. "Have you heard any conversations among the staff?" Victoria asked, her voice sharpening with focus. "Nothing specific, but there's an atmosphere of tension. The household managers have been having more frequent meetings, and several senior advisors have been working unusually late hours." Victoria rose from her chair and walked to the ornate mirror that dominated one wall of her sitting room. Her reflection showed a woman who had aged gracefully into royal life. Her auburn hair styled impeccably and her designer suit projecting authority and elegance. But for the first time in years, she noticed signs of stress around her eyes. "Elena, I want you to review all our recent communications and ensure everything is properly secured. Check the encryption on our financial transfers and verify that all our banking contacts are maintaining discretion." Elena nodded, understanding the implications. Their operation required absolute secrecy, and any breach could have catastrophic consequences. Victoria had always been meticulous about covering their tracks, but the unusual palace activity suggested potential scrutiny. "Should I be concerned about the Helvetian group meetings?" Elena asked. The last conversation with Director Klaus was quite detailed about palace operations. Victoria felt a chill of apprehension. Her relationship with the Helvetian Investment Group had been mutually beneficial, providing her with international investment opportunities while giving them insights into royal financial strategies and diplomatic positions. Klaus Miller, the group's director, had been particularly interested in information about the king's positions on various trade agreements. "When was the last communication with Klaus?" Victoria asked, trying to maintain her composure. 3 weeks ago. He requested information about the king's upcoming decisions regarding the northern mining rights. You provided the briefing documents as usual. The mining rights issue was highly confidential, involving potential agreements worth billions to the kingdom's economy. Victoria's access to Alexander's private briefings had made her a valuable asset to various international interests, but it also represented the kind of information sharing that could be considered treasonous. "Cancel this afternoon's donor meetings," Victoria instructed, her strategic mind shifting into crisis management mode. "I need time to prepare for whatever this throne room meeting entails." Elena gathered her materials quickly, recognizing the shift in Victoria's demeanor.
"Should I reach out to any of our contacts for information about what might be happening?"
"No," Victoria replied firmly. "Any unusual inquiries could draw unwanted attention. We need to maintain normal appearances while gathering information through observation." After Elena departed, Victoria remained alone with her thoughts. The elaborate lifestyle she had built depended on her position as Queen Consort and the access it provided to both royal resources and confidential information. The possibility that her activities had been discovered represented not just personal catastrophe, but potential criminal prosecution. She walked to her private safe, hidden behind a false panel in her bookshelf, and reviewed the documents stored there. Backup identification papers, encrypted account information, and emergency contact numbers for her international associates were all carefully organized. Victoria had always maintained contingency plans, understanding that royal life could change dramatically with little warning. The afternoon sunlight streaming through her windows seemed less warm as Victoria contemplated the possible scenarios ahead. Had Alexander discovered her financial activities? Were intelligence services investigating her international communications? Or was this truly an innocent royal protocol matter that her anxiety was magnifying unnecessarily? 20 years of careful planning, she murmured to herself, touching the royal insignia pendant that hung from her necklace. The symbol that had once represented ultimate achievement now felt like a weight around her neck. Victoria had married Alexander, believing she could manage both her personal ambitions and her royal duties indefinitely. The king's trusting nature and his focus on traditional governance had created opportunities she couldn't resist exploiting. But as 4 o'clock approached, she faced the possibility that her carefully constructed double life was about to collide with reality. The throne room awaited, and with it, answers that could change everything. The throne room of Valenhall Palace had witnessed centuries of momentous occasions, but none quite like what was about to unfold at 4 o'clock on this gray October afternoon. The massive chamber, with its soaring vaulted ceilings and walls lined with portraits of past monarchs, seemed to hold its breath as King Alexander took his position on the ancient throne. Lady Margaret Thornfield stood to the king's right, her usually calm demeanor betraying subtle signs of tension. Behind her, 3 members of the Privy Council had gathered as witnesses to what would become a defining moment in the kingdom's history. Palace security had been quietly increased throughout the building, though the public remained unaware of the crisis unfolding within the royal residence. Victoria entered the throne room precisely at 4 o'clock, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor with measured confidence. She had chosen a navy blue dress suit that projected both respect for the formal setting and her own authority as Queen Consort. Her jewelry was understated but elegant, and her composure appeared unshakable. "Your Majesty," Victoria said, offering the traditional curtsy as she approached the throne. Her voice carried no hint of the anxiety that had consumed her afternoon preparations. Alexander studied his wife's face carefully, searching for any sign that she suspected the true nature of this meeting. Victoria's ability to maintain perfect royal composure had always impressed him, but now that same quality felt like evidence of her capacity for deception. "Victoria," the king began, his voice carrying the formal tone reserved for official pronouncements, "please take a seat." A single chair had been placed in the center of the room, facing the throne. The positioning was deliberate and symbolic, creating physical distance that reflected the emotional chasm that had opened between them. Victoria settled into the chair with grace, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "I have summoned you here today to address matters of grave concern to the crown and to our kingdom," Alexander continued, his words echoing in the vast chamber. "Matters that require immediate resolution and decisive action." Victoria's training in royal protocol served her, well as she maintained eye contact with the king while internally calculating possible responses to various scenarios. "I am at your service, Your Majesty, as always." Alexander reached for a leather portfolio that Lady Margaret had placed beside the throne. The movement was deliberate and slow, building tension that seemed to fill the enormous room. When he opened the portfolio, Victoria caught a glimpse of official documents and what appeared to be photographs. "Over the past 6 months," Alexander said, his voice growing stronger with each word, "Palace security has conducted a comprehensive investigation into financial irregularities within the royal household. The scope and scale of what we have discovered has shocked even our most experienced advisors." Victoria felt her heart rate increase, but her expression remained perfectly controlled. Years of public appearances and diplomatic functions had taught her to manage her reactions under pressure. "I'm certain that any irregularities can be explained and resolved quickly." "Can they?" Alexander asked, removing the first document from the portfolio. "Can you explain unauthorized transfers totaling over £3 million from charitable accounts under your management? Money intended for veterans' housing and children's education programs." The specificity of the king's knowledge hit Victoria like a physical blow, though she managed to keep her breathing steady. Alexander wasn't fishing for information or making vague accusations.
He had detailed evidence,
which meant the investigation had been far more thorough than she had imagined possible. "I would need to review the specific transactions you're referencing," Victoria replied carefully. "Charitable fund management involves complex financial arrangements that may appear irregular to those unfamiliar with international philanthropy." Alexander's expression hardened as he removed a second document. "International philanthropy? Is that what you call the Helvetian Investment Group? Because our intelligence services have a different perspective on your regular meetings with Klaus Miller." The mention of Klaus's name confirmed Victoria's worst fears. If the intelligence services were involved, her communications had likely been monitored, her meetings recorded, and her international connections thoroughly investigated. The careful network she had built over 20 years was unraveling in real time. "Klaus Müller is a legitimate investment advisor who has helped optimize charitable fund performance," Victoria said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Klaus Müller is a former intelligence operative who specializes in extracting confidential information from government officials." Alexander countered, his tone becoming sharper. "And you have been providing him with details about state mining rights trade negotiations, and diplomatic strategies. Lady Margaret stepped forward and handed the king a small digital device. Victoria recognized it immediately as the type of recording equipment used throughout the palace for official meetings. Her mouth went dry as she realized the implications. "Perhaps you'd like to hear your own words," Alexander suggested, activating the device. Victoria's voice filled the throne room, captured in crystal-clear quality. "The old fool trusts me completely. Alexander never questions my access to his private briefings or my attendance at confidential meetings. He actually believes I'm interested in his boring economic policies." The sound of her own laughter, recorded during what she had believed was a private conversation with Elena, seemed to mock her from every corner of the vast chamber. Victoria closed her eyes briefly, understanding that her carefully constructed facade had been completely destroyed. 20 years, Victoria, Alexander said, his voice now heavy with personal pain rather than royal authority. 20 years of marriage, and this is how you truly see me. This is how you've always seen me. Victoria opened her eyes and met her husband's gaze directly. There was no point in continued denial or elaborate explanations. The evidence was overwhelming, and Alexander's knowledge was comprehensive. "Your Majesty, There's more," Alexander interrupted, removing additional recordings from the portfolio. "Hours of conversations detailing your true motivations for our marriage, your contempt for royal duties, and your systematic theft of funds intended for the people's welfare." The king stood from his throne, a gesture that commanded absolute attention in the formal setting. "Victoria Ashworth, you have violated every principle of royal service and betrayed the trust placed in you by both the crown and the people of this kingdom." Victoria realized that Alexander was speaking for the historical record, with witnesses present and likely additional recording equipment, capturing every word for posterity. This wasn't just a marital confrontation. It was an official royal proceeding. "By the authority vested in me as sovereign of this realm," Alexander continued, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of royal tradition, "I hereby revoke your title as Queen Consort, effective immediately." The words hung in the air like thunderclaps. Victoria felt the full impact of what she had lost in that moment. Not just her title, but her position, her access, her carefully built influence, and her future security. "Furthermore," the king continued, "you are hereby stripped of all royal privileges, patronages, and official duties. You will vacate the palace within 24 hours, and all royal accounts under your control are frozen pending full financial investigation." Victoria's composure finally cracked as the reality of her situation became clear. 20 years of careful planning had been destroyed in a single afternoon, and she faced an uncertain future that could include criminal prosecution and public disgrace. The woman who had entered the throne room as Queen Consort would leave as a private citizen facing the consequences of her ambitious schemes. The silence that followed King Alexander's pronouncement stretched endlessly through the throne room. Victoria remained seated, her hands gripping the arms of her chair as she processed the complete destruction of her life's work. The weight of lost titles, frozen assets, and public disgrace crashed over her like successive waves. "You have 24 hours, Alexander repeated, his voice softer now but no less final. "Palace security will escort you to your private quarters to collect personal belongings. All official items, including jewelry bearing the royal insignia, must remain." Victoria finally found her voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Alexander, surely we can discuss terms. After 20 years of marriage, there must be some consideration for terms." The king's interruption carried decades of suppressed hurt and betrayal. "What terms did you consider when you called me the old fool to your accomplices? What consideration did you show when you stole from children's charities to line your own pockets?" Lady Margaret stepped forward with a prepared document. "Mrs. Ashworth," she said, deliberately using Victoria's maiden name, "this outlines the legal proceedings that will follow. Criminal charges related to fraud, money laundering, and potential treason are being prepared by the Crown Prosecution Service." Victoria accepted the document with trembling hands. The legal language was dense, but certain phrases jumped out at her. Unauthorized access to state secrets, conspiracy to defraud charitable organizations, and potential sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years imprisonment. "I want to speak with my solicitor immediately," Victoria managed, her royal training finally abandoning her completely. Your legal representation will be arranged once you are in custody, Lady Margaret replied matter-of-factly. However, given the international nature of your alleged crimes, extradition requests may complicate your legal options. The mention of extradition sent another chill through Victoria. Her activities with the Helvetian Investment Group had crossed multiple international boundaries, potentially subjecting her to prosecution in several countries. Klaus Müller's organization operated throughout Europe, and her information sharing could be considered espionage by foreign governments. Two palace security officers entered the throne room, their presence indicating that the formal proceedings had concluded. Victoria recognized both men from her years as Queen Consort, and the awkwardness of the situation was evident in their respectful but firm demeanor. Mrs. Ashworth, the senior officer said quietly, "We're here to escort you to your quarters for the collection of personal items." Victoria stood slowly, her legs unsteady after the shock of the afternoon's revelations. As she moved toward the throne room's exit, she paused and turned back to Alexander one final time. "You'll regret this decision," she said, her voice carrying a trace of her former authority. "The publicity will damage the monarchy more than my actions ever could." Alexander met her gaze steadily. "The monarchy has survived far greater challenges than one person's greed and betrayal. Truth and justice will serve the crown better than continued deception." As Victoria left the throne room under escort, Alexander remained on his throne, suddenly looking older than his 62 years. The emotional toll of the confrontation was evident in his posture, though his resolve remained unshaken. "Your Majesty," Lady Margaret said gently, "the Prime Minister is waiting for your call. The media strategy needs to be finalized before news of this situation leaks." Alexander nodded wearily. "And Elena Rossi?" "Already in custody. She was arrested this morning when she attempted to access several of the compromised bank accounts. Our timing was deliberate to prevent any destruction of evidence." In her former private quarters, Victoria moved through rooms that had been her sanctuary for 20 years with mechanical precision. Each item she was permitted to take represented a fragment of her previous life, while everything else remained as evidence of her former position. The jewelry box on her dressing table contained pieces worth hundreds of thousands of pounds, but most bore royal insignia, or had been gifts from foreign dignitaries, making them officially property of the crown. Victoria was left with a few personal pieces from before her marriage, inadequate compensation for the lifestyle she was losing. Her personal art collection, accumulated through her connections in the auction world, would likely be seized as potential evidence of money laundering. The Swiss bank accounts that had provided her security were frozen, leaving her with limited immediate resources. Elena's absence was particularly jarring. For over 20 years, her secretary had been her closest confidant and partner in building their financial network. The realization that Elena had been arrested while trying to protect their assets highlighted how completely their operation had been compromised. "Ma'am," one of the security officers said respectfully, "we need to finish within the hour. Transport has been arranged to take you to temporary accommodation." Victoria looked around her sitting room one last time. The afternoon tea service remained on its silver tray, now cold and forgotten. The morning's newspaper lay open to a story about her upcoming charity gala, an event that would never happen. "Where am I being taken?" she asked. "A secure facility where you'll remain until formal charges are filed. Your solicitor will meet you there to discuss your legal options." As Victoria packed her final suitcase, she reflected on the calculated risks that had brought her to this moment. Every unauthorized transfer, every meeting with Klaus Müller, every piece of confidential information she had shared had seemed manageable at the time. The accumulation of small compromises had built into a mountain of evidence that now threatened to crush her completely. The palace staff who had served her for 2 decades watched from doorways as she was escorted through corridors she had once navigated as their superior. Their expressions ranged from shock to disappointment, reflecting the broader sense of betrayal that her actions had created throughout the royal household. Outside her former windows, Victoria could see journalists beginning to gather at the palace gates. Word of unusual activity had already reached the media, and within hours the story would dominate international headlines. The woman who had spent years carefully managing her public image would soon become the subject of scrutiny beyond her worst nightmares. As the palace doors closed behind her for the final time, Victoria understood that her 20-year reign as Queen Consort had ended not with ceremonial dignity, but with criminal prosecution. The throne room confrontation had been only the beginning of consequences that would reshape her life permanently. The golden carriage, that had once transported her to state occasions, was replaced by an unmarked vehicle carrying her toward an uncertain future, filled with legal battles and public shame. The palace communications office had transformed into a crisis management center within hours of Victoria's departure. Communications. Director James Hartwell had assembled his senior team for an emergency session that would determine how the monarchy navigated its most serious scandal in decades. The story breaks in 6 hours, Hartwell announced to the gathered officials. Every major newspaper has sources confirming unusual activity at the palace. We need to control the narrative before speculation spirals out of control. Prime Minister Rebecca Clark had arrived for urgent consultations with King Alexander, her presence highlighting the potential constitutional implications of the crisis. The relationship between the Crown and elected government required careful coordination during periods of royal controversy. Your Majesty, Prime Minister Clark said as she entered the King's private study, the cabinet has been briefed on the situation. We're prepared to provide full support for whatever approach you choose to take. Alexander looked exhausted but determined as he reviewed the proposed public statement. Rebecca, I need to know your honest assessment of the political fallout. Will this damage the monarchy's relationship with Parliament? That depends entirely on how we handle the next 48 hours, the Prime Minister replied candidly. If we demonstrate transparency and decisive action, the public will likely view this as evidence of the Crown's integrity. If we appear to be covering up or minimizing the situation, it could trigger serious constitutional questions. Lady Margaret entered with updates from the ongoing investigation. Your Majesty, the financial forensics team has uncovered additional irregularities. The total amount of diverted funds now exceeds £5 million, and we've identified connections to tax avoidance schemes in 3 different countries. The scope of Victoria's activities continued to expand as investigators gained access to her encrypted communications and hidden accounts. Each new discovery reinforced the gravity of her betrayal while also raising questions about palace security and oversight procedures. The Helvetian Investment Group situation is particularly concerning, Lady Margaret continued. Intelligence services have confirmed that Klaus Muller's organization has been under surveillance for potential espionage activities. Victoria's association with them could trigger international diplomatic complications. Alexander understood the delicate balance required. The palace needed to demonstrate that it had acted decisively to address criminal behavior, while also maintaining the dignity and stability expected of the monarchy. Public confidence in royal institutions depended on their ability to police themselves effectively. What's our strategy for the press announcement? Alexander asked. James Hartwell consulted his prepared notes. Complete transparency about the investigation and criminal charges, while emphasizing the palace's cooperation with law enforcement. We'll position this as evidence of the Crown's commitment to accountability rather than a failure of royal oversight. The communications team had spent hours crafting language that would satisfy public demands for information while protecting ongoing legal proceedings. Every word would be scrutinized by media analysts and political commentators seeking evidence of royal cover-ups or inadequate responses. The European press is already running preliminary stories, Hartwell reported. German and Swiss publications are focusing on the international money laundering aspects, while French media is emphasizing the potential espionage implications. Victoria's criminal activities had inadvertently created an international incident that required coordination between multiple governments and intelligence agencies. The Helvetian Investment Group's operations extended throughout Europe, making Victoria's case relevant to several ongoing investigations. Prime Minister Clark reviewed intelligence briefings that detailed the broader implications of Victoria's activities. The information she shared about mining rights negotiations could have influenced international commodity markets. We're looking at potential securities fraud on a massive scale. The economic implications added another layer of complexity to the crisis. Victoria's access to confidential government information had given her international associates unfair advantages in various business negotiations. potentially costing the kingdom's economy millions in lost revenues. Your Majesty, Lady Margaret said, we've also discovered that several of Victoria's charity events were actually money laundering operations. The donors she cultivated were unknowingly participating in financial crimes that helped fund her personal accounts. This revelation was particularly damaging because it implicated innocent, charitable contributors in Victoria's criminal network. Wealthy donors who had trusted the Queen Consort's reputation now faced potential scrutiny from investigators examining the flow of funds through her various organizations. Alexander felt the weight of responsibility for the damage Victoria's actions had caused. We need to ensure that every penny stolen from legitimate charities is recovered and properly distributed. The people and organizations who trusted the Crown's charitable work cannot be allowed to suffer for one person's greed. The palace's legal team was already working with prosecutors to establish restitution procedures, but the complex international nature of Victoria's financial network would make recovery efforts extremely challenging. Some funds had been moved through multiple shell companies across different jurisdictions, creating legal obstacles that could take years to resolve. The staff morale situation is also concerning, Lady Margaret reported. Many longtime palace employees feel betrayed and are questioning their own judgment. Victoria interacted with hundreds of staff members over 20 years, and many considered her a friend and mentor. The personal impact on palace personnel had been severe. Victoria had cultivated relationships throughout the royal household, using her position to gather information and maintain loyalty, while secretly exploiting her access for personal gain. Staff members now questioned every interaction they had shared with her. I want to address the entire palace staff personally, Alexander decided. They deserve to hear directly from me about what happened and how we're moving forward. Their dedication to royal service shouldn't be tainted by one person's betrayal. As evening approached, the palace prepared for the media storm that would begin with the next morning's newspapers. Photographers had gathered outside the gates, and television crews were setting up equipment for what would become one of the most significant royal news events in recent history. The international reaction will be intense, Prime Minister Clark warned. Republican movements in several Commonwealth countries will likely use this as ammunition for their campaigns. We need to be prepared for broader constitutional challenges. Alexander understood that Victoria's crimes had created an opportunity for opponents of the monarchy to question the institution's relevance and effectiveness. The Crown's response would need to demonstrate not just accountability for past failures, but also renewed commitment to transparent governance. One final question, Your Majesty, James Hartwell said. How do you want to handle personal questions about your marriage and whether you suspected Victoria's activities? Alexander considered this carefully. The public would naturally wonder how a husband could remain unaware of his wife's extensive criminal enterprise for 20 years. The answer would require balancing personal honesty with royal dignity. I'll tell the truth, Alexander replied simply. I trusted my wife completely, and that trust was systematically exploited. The failure was mine, but the crimes were hers. The palace prepared for dawn, when the full story would finally reach the public and begin reshaping perceptions of the monarchy forever. The morning brought chaos to newsrooms across the globe as the story of Victoria's downfall dominated every major publication. The headlines were stark and unforgiving. Royal scandal rocks palace, Queen Consort charged with fraud, and 20 years of royal deception exposed. BBC News had assembled a panel of constitutional experts, royal historians and political analysts to dissect the implications of the unprecedented scandal. The coverage was comprehensive and relentless, with new details emerging hourly as journalists investigated every aspect of Victoria's activities. This represents the most serious breach of royal trust in modern history, declared Professor Eleanor Whitfield, a constitutional scholar at Oxford University. The Queen Consort held a position of unique privilege and access, and her systematic abuse of that position calls into question the entire system of royal oversight. Public reaction was swift and intense across social media platforms. The hashtag #DuckerRoyalScandal trended worldwide within hours, with opinions ranging from shocked disappointment to calls for wholesale reform of the monarchy. Many citizens expressed feeling personally betrayed by Victoria's exploitation of charitable causes they had supported. Margaret Thompson, a retired teacher from Yorkshire who had donated regularly to Victoria's Literacy Foundation, spoke to reporters outside her home. I trusted her completely. She seemed so genuine about helping children, and now I find out my money was probably stolen. How can we ever trust any of them again? The sentiment was echoed throughout the kingdom, as citizens grappled with the realization that their charitable contributions had been diverted for personal enrichment. The scandal had transformed from a royal family drama into a personal betrayal felt by thousands of ordinary people. International reaction was equally severe. Queen Isabella of Merida, a close ally of the kingdom, issued a carefully worded statement expressing deep concern about the reported activities while maintaining support for King Alexander personally. The diplomatic language barely concealed the shock felt by royal families throughout Europe. This scandal affects every monarchy, explained Dr. Hans Müller, a European political analyst. When one royal house faces credibility issues, it raises questions about the institution of monarchy itself. Republican movements across Europe will undoubtedly use this as evidence that hereditary privilege breeds corruption. The Swiss government had already launched its own investigation into the Helvetian investment group's activities, with authorities confirming that several high-profile individuals had been under surveillance for suspected money laundering operations. Victoria's association with Klaus Müller had placed her at the center of an international criminal network that authorities had been tracking for years. Mrs. Ashworth was providing information that allowed criminal organizations to manipulate international markets, announced Swiss federal prosecutor Andreas Weber. Her cooperation with these groups constitutes a serious threat to European financial security. The economic implications continued to unfold as market analysts examined the potential impact of Victoria's information sharing on various industries. Mining companies whose negotiations had been compromised by leaked confidential information faced scrutiny from shareholders and regulatory authorities. Stock prices for several major corporations fluctuated wildly as investors tried to assess their exposure to the scandal. Companies that had benefited from advanced knowledge of government policies through Victoria's intelligence sharing now faced potential legal challenges and massive financial penalties. The ripple effects will continue for months, warned London Stock Exchange analyst David Chen. Every business deal influenced by leaked information will be examined, and some companies may face civil lawsuits from competitors who were disadvantaged by insider trading. Prime Minister Clark addressed Parliament in an emergency session, facing intense questioning from opposition leaders about the government's oversight of royal activities. The constitutional separation between Crown and government provided some protection, but critics argued that closer supervision might have prevented Victoria's crimes. The palace is an independent institution with its own security and oversight procedures, Clark explained to a packed House of Commons. However, this scandal highlights the need for enhanced transparency and accountability measures across all public institutions. Opposition leader Michael Harrison pressed for broader reforms. How can the Prime Minister assure the British people that other members of the royal family aren't engaged in similar activities? What oversight exists to prevent future abuses of royal privilege? The questions reflected growing public demand for systematic changes to royal operations. Traditional arguments about royal autonomy and historical precedent seemed inadequate in the face of such extensive criminal activity by a senior royal family. Member media coverage intensified as journalists investigated Victoria's background and previous activities. Her pre-marriage career as an art curator came under scrutiny, with former colleagues revealing that she had always been ambitious and financially motivated. Victoria was brilliant at cultivating wealthy clients, recalled former gallery owner Patricia Williams. She had an incredible ability to identify what people wanted to hear and position herself accordingly. I suppose those same skills served her well in royal life. The art world revelations added another dimension to Victoria's character profile, suggesting that her manipulative behavior predated her marriage to Alexander. Journalists began examining her early relationships and business dealings for signs of the patterns that would later characterize her royal activities. International law enforcement agencies coordinated their responses to Victoria's multinational criminal network. Europol issued warrants for several associates of the Helvetian investment group, while banking authorities in multiple countries froze accounts connected to the money laundering operation. This Investigation extends far beyond one individual, explained. Europol Director General Marie Dubois, we're dealing with a sophisticated criminal organization that used royal access to facilitate financial crimes across multiple jurisdictions. The scope of the investigation continued to expand as authorities uncovered additional connections between Victoria's activities and other criminal enterprises. Her systematic exploitation of royal privilege had provided cover for international fraud schemes that might have operated undetected for years. Without the palace's internal investigation, public opinion polls conducted in the days following the scandal's revelation showed a complex mix of reactions. While most citizens expressed disappointment and anger about Victoria's crimes, support for King Alexander personally remained relatively strong. Many viewed him as a victim of his wife's deception rather than an accomplice to her activities. The king's decisive action in removing Victoria's title and cooperating with law enforcement has preserved some public confidence, noted pollster James Reed. However, long-term damage to the monarchy's reputation is inevitable, and constitutional questions about royal oversight will persist. As the first week of coverage concluded, it became clear that Victoria's scandal had triggered far more than a royal family crisis. The case had exposed systemic vulnerabilities in international financial systems and raised fundamental questions about accountability in hereditary institutions. The woman who had once been celebrated as a devoted queen, Consort had inadvertently become a catalyst for examining the role of monarchy in modern democratic societies. 6 months after the throne room confrontation that ended Victoria's reign as Queen Consort, the full consequences of her 20-year deception had reshaped both the monarchy and the kingdom's approach to royal oversight. The woman who had once commanded international respect now sat in a maximum security courtroom, facing the final phase of her criminal trial. Victoria appeared dramatically changed from her royal days. Gone were the designer suits and elegant jewelry, replaced by standard prison attire and the hollow expression of someone who had lost everything. Her legal team, led by prominent defense attorney Sir Richard Blackwood, had mounted an aggressive defense, but the evidence against her remained overwhelming. Mrs. Ashworth systematically exploited her position for personal gain over 2 decades. Crown prosecutor Catherine Mills declared in her closing arguments, she stole from charities meant to help the most vulnerable members of our society while betraying state secrets to foreign criminal organizations. The trial had revealed even more extensive criminal activities than originally discovered. Forensic accountants had traced over £8 million through Victoria's network of shell companies and international accounts. Her cooperation with Klaus Müller and the Helvetian Investment Group had compromised national security information, affecting trade negotiations worth billions. Elena Rossi had agreed to testify against Victoria in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing detailed testimony about their financial operations. Her insider knowledge had been crucial in unraveling the complex money laundering schemes that Victoria had constructed over the years. Victoria instructed me to create false documentation for charitable expenditures, Elena testified, avoiding eye contact with her former employer. We would claim funds were spent on legitimate programs while actually transferring the money to accounts she controlled. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Bank records, recorded conversations, and witness testimony painted a picture of calculated greed and systematic betrayal of public trust. Victoria's defense team struggled to counter the mountain of evidence while attempting to portray her as a victim of manipulation by more sophisticated criminal partners. King Alexander had not attended the trial, but his written statement was read to the court. The defendant exploited my trust and the trust of our entire nation. Her crimes have damaged institutions that serve our people and compromised relationships with international allies. Justice must be served regardless of her former position. The jury deliberated for only 18 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all major charges: fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and violations of the Official Secrets Act. The courtroom was silent as Judge Harold Morrison prepared to announce Victoria's sentence. Mrs. Ashworth, you have been convicted of crimes that strike at the heart of public service and national security, Judge Morrison declared. Your systematic abuse of royal privilege, and your betrayal of charitable donors require the maximum penalties under law. Victoria was sentenced to 22 years in prison, without possibility of parole for 15 years. Additional civil penalties required her to forfeit all remaining assets, estimated at over £12 million, for restitution to the charities and individuals she had defrauded. The Helvetian Investment Group investigation had expanded internationally, resulting in arrests across Europe and the freezing of assets worth hundreds of millions of euros. Klaus Müller faced extradition to multiple countries on charges ranging from money laundering to espionage. Victoria's cooperation with investigators had been minimal, limiting any potential reduction in her sentence. Meanwhile, King Alexander had begun the difficult process of rebuilding public trust in the monarchy. Comprehensive reforms had been implemented, including independent financial auditing of all royal accounts, enhanced background checks for palace staff, and regular reporting to parliamentary oversight committees. The Crown must demonstrate transparency and accountability in everything we do, Alexander announced during his first public address since the scandal. One person's crimes cannot be allowed to undermine centuries of royal service to our people. The king had also established a Royal Accountability Commission, headed by former Supreme Court Justice Lady Amanda Foster, to review all aspects of palace operations and recommend additional safeguards against future abuses. The commission's work would ensure that no individual could again exploit royal privilege for personal gain. Public opinion had gradually shifted toward supporting Alexander's handling of the crisis. His decisive action in removing Victoria's title and cooperating fully with law enforcement had demonstrated the monarchy's commitment to justice over loyalty. Approval ratings for the king personally had recovered to pre-scandal levels, though the institution of monarchy remained under closer scrutiny. King Alexander's response showed real leadership, commented political analyst Dr. Sarah Pemberton. He chose accountability over protection, which has actually strengthened public confidence in his judgment and integrity. The charitable organizations affected by Victoria's crimes had received substantial compensation through asset forfeiture proceedings. New oversight procedures ensured that royal patronage of charities included independent financial monitoring to prevent future fraud. Many organizations reported that public donations had actually increased as citizens sought to support legitimate charitable work. International relations had been more challenging to repair. Several European allies had privately expressed concerns about information security and the reliability of confidential communications with the royal household. Alexander had personally visited key allies to rebuild trust and demonstrate the effectiveness of new security measures. The scandal forced us to examine our own security procedures, admitted a senior diplomat from a neighboring kingdom. While damaging, it may ultimately result in stronger protections across all royal institutions. Victoria's former quarters in the palace had been converted into offices for the Royal Accountability Commission, a symbolic transformation that emphasized the monarchy's commitment to transparency. Tours of the palace now included information about the new oversight measures, turning potential embarrassment into evidence of institutional reform. Elena Rossi had been sentenced to 8 years in prison for her role in the conspiracy, though her cooperation with prosecutors had significantly reduced her potential punishment. She remained in protective custody due to concerns about retaliation from international criminal associates. As the first anniversary of Victoria's downfall approached, King Alexander had begun making public appearances with increased frequency, gradually rebuilding the ceremonial aspects of royal life. He had chosen to remain unmarried, focusing entirely on his duties as sovereign and the ongoing work of institutional reform. This experience has taught me that trust must be earned continuously, Alexander reflected during a private interview. The crown serves at the pleasure of the people, and we must prove ourselves worthy of that trust every day. Victoria's story had become a cautionary tale about the corruption of privilege and the importance of accountability in public institutions. Law schools throughout the kingdom now used her case as an example of how institutional power could be abused when proper oversight was lacking. The woman who had once dreamed of leveraging royal position for personal gain now served as an unwitting catalyst for strengthening the very institution she had betrayed. Her crimes had forced modernization and reform that might have taken decades to achieve under normal circumstances. In her prison cell, Victoria had reportedly expressed no remorse for her actions, instead blaming Alexander and the royal system for her downfall. Former associates described her as bitter and unrepentant, still believing that her intelligence and ambition entitled her to the wealth and influence she had. Stolen, the kingdom had emerged from its greatest royal scandal in centuries with institutions stronger and more transparent than before. King Alexander's decisive leadership during the crisis had proven that even ancient monarchies could adapt and reform when faced with betrayal from within. Victoria's legacy would be measured not in the damage she caused, but in the positive changes her crimes had inadvertently inspired throughout the realm.